Cities like Gotham are not simply places where crime happens. They are symbolic territories where societies attempt to contain the darker impulses that move beneath the surface of human behavior. Laws, institutions, courts, police forces, and prisons form the architecture of that containment. They exist not because violence disappears, but because violence must be given boundaries. A city survives only when its inhabitants believe that those boundaries still hold, even when they occasionally fracture under pressure. Yet there are moments when the illusion of control collapses completely. A robbery that becomes a murder. A crime that arrives too quickly for the system to respond. A gunshot in an alley, or the quiet annihilation of a family that never expected danger to reach their doorstep. These moments do more than take lives. They expose something unsettling about the structure meant to prevent them. They reveal that the distance between order and chaos is often thinner than society is willing to admit. Out of these fractures emerge figures who refuse to remain passive witnesses. Individuals who decide that the system is no longer enough, that justice must be carried by human will rather than delegated entirely to institutions. These figures often appear similar at first glance. They were the same determination, the same intolerance toward criminal violence, the same refusal to accept the passivity that allows predators to operate within society's blind spots. Yet beneath that similarity lies a division that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Batman and Frank Castle stand on opposite sides of that division. Both men are born from the same fundamental rupture. Both witness the sudden destruction of the world that once defined their lives. In one case, a child watches his parents fall in the darkness of a Gotham alley, learning in a single moment that the structures meant to protect him cannot always intervene. In the other, a soldier returns home from war only to find his family murdered in an act of casual brutality that exposes the fragility of civilian life. These experiences do not merely create grief. They reorganize the entire psychological landscape through which these men understand the world. At first, the responses appear almost identical. Both men train their bodies into instruments of relentless discipline. Both dedicate themselves to hunting those who exploit weakness and fear. Both step into the shadows of their cities and begin operating where the legal system struggles to reach. In the early stages, their actions could almost be mistaken for variations of the same mission. Two vigilantes attempting to correct the failures of institutions that move too slowly to confront the violence unfolding around them. But something subtle begins to diverge. Bruce Wayne builds a system around himself. Every action, every strategy, every confrontation is contained within a rule that remains invisible to the criminals he pursues but absolutely binding to him. Violence may be used. Fear may be weaponized. Criminal empires may be dismantled through relentless pressure. Yet there exists a boundary that cannot be crossed. Life cannot be taken. The line between justice and execution must remain intact, even if the men on the other side of that line deserve death. Frank Castle reaches the opposite conclusion. Where Bruce Wayne sees a boundary that must be protected, Frank Castle sees the very weakness that allows criminal networks to survive. His experience of war has already dissolved the illusion that violence can be contained through moral restraint alone. On the battlefield, hesitation leads to death. Enemies who are spared often return with greater brutality. When Castle looks at organized crime, cartels, and serial predators, he does not see citizens who must be arrested. He sees hostile forces that operate by the same logic he learned in combat. The system that Bruce Wayne attempts to preserve appears to Frank Castle as a structure built on denial. Courts that release killers after procedural delays. Prisons that function as temporary pauses rather than permanent solutions. Criminal empires that regenerate faster than they can be dismantled through legal means. To Castle, the moral line that Batman refuses to cross resembles a wall protecting the very people responsible for destroying innocent lives. Justice without finality begins to look indistinguishable from tolerance. The tension between these two perspectives does not emerge from ideological debate. It emerges from the raw reality of violence and how human beings interpret its consequences. Both men have seen the same brutality. Both have lost everything that once anchored their identities to ordinary life. Yet the psychological architecture built upon that trauma moves in radically different directions. Batman becomes a guardian of the boundary. The Punisher becomes its executioner. This difference transforms the meaning of their missions. Batman fights crime in order to preserve the fragile legitimacy of the system that governs society. His restraint is not weakness but structural necessity. If the protector of the city becomes an executioner, then the distinction between hero and criminal collapses entirely. Gotham would no longer be a city struggling with violence. It would become a territory ruled by whoever is capable of imposing their will through force. Frank Castle no longer believes that such distinctions exist. From his perspective, the territory has already collapsed. The criminals he hunts are not misguided citizens who deserve rehabilitation. They are predators who exploit the very restraints that Batman protects. To eliminate them is not an act of revenge in Castle's mind. It is the correction of a system too compromised to defend the innocent without external intervention. Two men therefore emerge from the same tragedy, carrying incompatible visions of justice. One believes the line between justice and vengeance must remain absolute, because crossing it would destroy the moral foundation that separates civilization from chaos. The other believes the line is an illusion maintained by institutions unwilling to confront the full reality of violence. In his world, the only meaningful justice is the one that guarantees a criminal will never harm anyone again. Between these two visions lies the central tension of their existence. Not simply whether criminals deserve to die, but whether the preservation of moral boundaries is more important than the elimination of those who exploit them. Batman protects the system even when it fails. The Punisher replaces the system entirely with the logic of war. Both claim to be defending the innocent, yet their methods reveal fundamentally different answers to the same question. When the system collapses, what must justice become? The origins of Bruce Wayne and Frank Castle appear almost interchangeable when reduced to their most basic narrative elements. Both lose their families to sudden violence. Both experience the collapse of a personal world that once felt stable and predictable. Both reach the same immediate conclusion that the system meant to protect ordinary people cannot always respond in time. Yet the psychological terrain created by these tragedies begins to diverge almost immediately, shaped by the different environments through which each man processes the same fundamental wound. Bruce Wayne's trauma occurs at the very center of Gotham's symbolic geography. Crime Alley is not simply a location within the city. It functions as a fracture point in Gotham's moral architecture. The murder of Thomas and Martha Wayne does not only destroy a family. It exposes the vulnerability of a city that believed wealth, influence, and civic institutions could create distance from the violence that defines its darker neighborhoods. In that moment, the illusion of insulation collapses. The child who witnesses it learns that no position within the social hierarchy can guarantee safety. What Bruce Wayne builds in response is not simply a crusade against criminals. It is a reconstruction of order itself. The discipline he imposes upon his life resembles the creation of a living institution. His training, his surveillance networks, the technologies he develops, and the symbolic identity he constructs as Batman all function as components of a larger system designed to correct the weaknesses that allowed that alleyway murder to happen. Gotham's failure becomes the blueprint for the structure he intends to impose upon it. Yet that structure depends entirely on restraint. Bruce Wayne recognizes something unsettling about the violence he has chosen to wield. Every encounter with criminals places him dangerously close to the same threshold that created his trauma. The gun that killed his parents was not held by a monster from outside society. It was held by a desperate man whose own life had collapsed under pressures Gotham itself had produced. If Batman allows himself to become an executioner, the distinction between protector and predator dissolves instantly. He would not be preventing the crime that defined his childhood. He would be repeating it under the banner of justice. Frank Castle arrives at the same trauma through an entirely different path. Before the destruction of his family, Castle already understands violence in a way Bruce Wayne never does. His life as a soldier places him inside environments where the logic of survival is brutally simple. Enemies are not arrested. They are eliminated. The battlefield does not recognize the moral hesitations that govern civilian life. Decisions must be immediate, decisive, and irreversible, because hesitation allows hostile forces to regroup and return with greater ferocity. When Castle returns from war, he attempts to re-enter the civilian world that operates by completely different rules. Families live inside suburbs that assume stability. Criminals are processed through courts that promise fairness and procedure. The state claims to regulate violence through institutions designed to protect rights rather than pursue efficiency. For a brief moment, Castle attempts to inhabit this structure, believing that the brutality he experienced in combat belongs to another realm entirely. Then his family is murdered. The event that destroys Frank Castle's life does more than create grief. It confirms his deepest suspicion about the fragility of civilian order. The structures that claim to protect ordinary people are slow, constrained, and often compromised by corruption or bureaucratic hesitation. Criminal networks operate with a degree of ruthlessness that the legal system struggles to match. The gap between these two realities becomes visible the moment Castle begins investigating the circumstances surrounding his family's deaths. From that point forward, the battlefield logic returns. Castle does not see himself abandoning justice. He believes he is restoring it. The criminals he hunts are not random targets chosen out of rage. They represent systems of violence that have already demonstrated their ability to manipulate legal institutions in order to survive. Drug cartels, organized crime syndicates, traffickers, and serial predators exist in a gray zone where the law moves too slowly to dismantle them permanently. Castle replaces that delay with finality. The contrast between Batman and the Punisher therefore emerges not from their trauma, but from their interpretation of what that trauma reveals about the world. Bruce Wayne sees the murder of his parents as proof that Gotham's institutions must be strengthened and protected, even if he must operate outside them temporarily in order to prevent further collapse. His mission depends on the belief that the city can eventually heal if the boundary between justice and revenge remains intact. Killing criminals would transform Batman into another unpredictable force within the same chaotic ecosystem he is trying to stabilize. Frank Castle sees the murder of his family as proof that those institutions have already failed beyond repair. The criminals responsible will continue operating as long as they remain alive to rebuild their networks. Every arrest becomes temporary. Every prison sentence becomes a delay rather than an end. Castle concludes that the system's greatest weakness is its refusal to acknowledge that certain forms of violence cannot be contained through restraint. This difference reshapes the meaning of their identities. Batman becomes a symbol that Gotham can project its remaining hope onto. His presence reinforces the idea that justice still operates within boundaries, even when delivered through unconventional methods. The criminals he pursues may fear him, but they also understand that his power is constrained by a rule they cannot break. That rule stabilizes the psychological terrain of the city. Batman's restraint becomes the invisible wall preventing Gotham from collapsing entirely into the logic of war. The Punisher does the opposite. Frank Castle introduces the battlefield into civilian space. Criminals are no longer arrested. They are hunted with the precision of military operations. Networks disappear overnight because their leaders never return. Fear spreads through the underworld, not because Castle represents justice, but because he represents inevitability. Anyone connected to violent criminal enterprises becomes a potential target within a system that offers no appeals and no second chances. The public reacts to these figures in radically different ways. Batman operates inside the symbolic economy of heroism. Even those who question his methods can imagine him as a protector who respects the moral architecture of society. The Punisher disrupts that architecture completely. Some see him as the only figure willing to confront criminals without hesitation. Others see him as the final stage of vigilante justice, a man who has allowed personal trauma to justify permanent war against anyone he considers guilty. Both interpretations contain uncomfortable truths. Batman's restraint allows criminals to survive encounters that might otherwise end their careers permanently. Some escape Arkham Asylum again and again, leaving new victims in their wake. Gotham remains trapped in a cycle where the same predators return because the system refuses to cross the threshold that would eliminate them entirely. Castle eliminates that cycle. Yet in doing so he removes the very distinction that prevents society from sliding into permanent retribution. If execution becomes the standard response to crime, then every authority capable of wielding lethal force becomes judge and executioner simultaneously. The structure that separates law from violence begins to dissolve. This is the psychological terrain in which their conflict takes shape. Batman believes that crossing the line would destroy the moral order he is trying to preserve. Frank Castle believes that refusing to cross it guarantees that criminals will continue exploiting the system's hesitation. Each man sees the other not merely as misguided, but as dangerously wrong about the nature of justice itself. And that disagreement cannot remain theoretical forever. Sooner or later the same territory will demand both of them to act. The conflict between Batman and Frank Castle does not begin with confrontation. It begins with territory. Gotham is a city that has long existed under Batman's silent jurisdiction. Its rooftops, alleys, docks, and abandoned industrial corridors form a landscape that responds to his presence like a living organism adjusting to a dominant predator. Criminal networks in Gotham adapt to the rhythm of the Dark Knight's patrols. They move operations into shadows they believe he will not reach. They construct contingencies for the moment his silhouette appears above them. Fear becomes a structural force inside the city's underworld, shaping behavior even when Batman is not physically present. This ecosystem operates according to an implicit contract. Criminals understand that Batman will come for them, brutally, relentlessly, yet they also understand something else. They will survive the encounter. Broken bones, shattered operations, prison sentences. But survival remains possible. The system remains intact because Batman enforces violence without crossing the boundary that would transform him into an executioner. Gotham's underworld fears him, but it also understands the rules that define his presence. The arrival of Frank Castle destabilizes that structure almost immediately. Castle does not enter Gotham as a vigilante attempting to integrate into its existing order. He enters as a soldier entering hostile territory. His investigations quickly reveal something that Batman has spent years attempting to manage rather than eliminate. Organized crime in Gotham is not a series of isolated gangs. It is a resilient ecosystem built on overlapping alliances, corruption inside municipal institutions, and a revolving door between incarceration and release. Criminal empires fracture under pressure, but rarely disappear completely. For Castle, this pattern is not surprising. It is predictable. The system Batman protects resembles the fragile stabilization programs Castle witnessed in war zones. Temporary victories, arrests that remove a leader only for another to replace him. Operations dismantled only to reappear under different names months later. From Castle's perspective, Gotham is not a city struggling with crime. It is a battlefield where the enemy has learned how to survive inside the limitations imposed on those trying to stop them. His response follows the logic he understands best. Castle begins targeting Gotham's criminal hierarchy with the precision of military strikes. Leaders vanish overnight. Safe houses erupt into sudden violence that leaves entire organizations decapitated before they can reorganize. Informants within criminal networks begin whispering about a force that does not interrogate or intimidate. It simply eliminates. The pattern spreads quickly through the underworld. Fear changes its character. Batman's presence once represented punishment. Castle represents extinction. At first, Gotham's criminals do not understand what is happening. Bodies appear in warehouses and abandoned apartments. Entire crews disappear without warning. Drug distribution networks collapse because the individuals coordinating them never return. The violence is surgical rather than chaotic. Castle does not leave spectacle behind. He leaves absence. An empire that once relied on fear begins dissolving because its leadership structure is being removed faster than replacements can emerge. The city responds with confusion. Law enforcement begins discovering the results of Castle's campaign without understanding the mechanism producing them. Organized crime statistics shift dramatically. Murders within criminal circles spike as surviving members scramble to consolidate power. Gotham's police department becomes aware that someone is systematically dismantling criminal operations with an efficiency the legal system has never been able to achieve. Batman becomes aware of the same pattern. At first, he assumes a temporary power struggle inside Gotham's criminal world has escalated into open warfare. But the deeper he investigates, the clearer the pattern becomes. These killings are not random acts of gang violence. They are strategic removals of key figures whose absence destabilizes entire networks. Whoever is responsible understands criminal infrastructure with unsettling precision. Eventually, the evidence leads him to the same conclusion Gotham's underworld has already reached. Frank Castle is operating inside the city. Batman recognizes the name immediately. Castle's reputation has spread far beyond the neighborhoods where his operations usually occur. Intelligence communities, law enforcement agencies, and criminal networks all understand the same basic truth about the man known as the Punisher. He does not dismantle criminal systems. He erases them. Every territory he enters eventually becomes inhospitable to the organizations that once controlled it. From Batman's perspective, this development represents a structural threat far greater than the criminals Castle is killing. Gotham survives through a fragile balance of forces. Crime persists, but the mechanisms controlling it remain predictable. Criminal empires know Batman's limits. The police know Batman's methods. Even the city's most dangerous villains understand that their survival depends on navigating the boundaries Batman enforces. Remove those boundaries and the ecosystem begins mutating in unpredictable ways. Castle has already begun that mutation. Criminals who once avoided lethal escalation because Batman would intervene are now responding to Castle's tactics by increasing their own brutality. Leaders begin ordering preemptive assassinations against rivals they suspect of cooperating with the Punisher. Paranoia spreads through the underworld as no one can determine who will be targeted next. Violence multiplies because the structure that once regulated it has been replaced with the logic of annihilation. Batman understands what this means. If Castle continues operating in Gotham, the city will not become safer. It will become unstable. Criminal organizations facing extinction will abandon restraint entirely. Civilian casualties will increase as gangs escalate their methods in order to survive. The boundary Batman has spent years enforcing will collapse under the pressure of a war Gotham was never designed to contain. For Frank Castle, the situation looks very different. From his perspective, Gotham's criminal ecosystem has already proven its resilience precisely because Batman refuses to cross the line Castle has already crossed. Every gang leader Batman arrests eventually returns to rebuild their operations. Every cartel dismantled through legal means eventually reappears. The city remains trapped in an endless cycle because the one figure powerful enough to end that cycle refuses to deliver the final blow. Castle sees Batman not as a protector, but as a stabilizing force for criminals. By refusing to kill, Batman preserves the possibility that Gotham's predators will survive their encounters with him. They may be imprisoned temporarily. Their operations may collapse under the pressure of his interventions, but the individuals responsible remain alive to rebuild. In Castle's view, Batman's moral restraint functions as an invisible shield protecting the very people he claims to oppose. The territory they now share cannot contain both interpretations. One man believes Gotham must remain governed by boundaries that prevent justice from becoming revenge. The other believes those boundaries are precisely what allow the worst criminals to continue existing. As Castle's campaign intensifies and Batman's investigations bring him closer to the source of the killings, the space between those positions begins to shrink. Sooner or later they will occupy the same street at the same moment. And when that moment arrives, the question will no longer be theoretical. The moment Batman and Frank Castle finally intersect does not resemble the collision of two enemies meeting for the first time. It resembles the closing of a circle that had been tightening for years without either man fully acknowledging it. Gotham's underworld has already felt the gravitational pull of both figures. One enforces pressure without annihilation. The other removes the target entirely. The territory cannot sustain both forces indefinitely without forcing them into direct confrontation. Their first encounter occurs in the kind of place where Gotham hides the machinery of its criminal economy. An abandoned industrial complex near the harbor, where smuggling routes intersect with distribution networks, feeding narcotics into the city's poorest neighborhoods. Intelligence gathered by Batman suggests a meeting between multiple criminal factions attempting to reorganize after Castle's earlier strikes dismantled their leadership structure. It is precisely the kind of gathering Batman typically disrupts before violence escalates further. Castle has reached the same conclusion through a different method. Where Batman gathers intelligence through surveillance and informants, Castle studies patterns. Supply routes, financial transfers, communication networks. The meeting represents an opportunity not to arrest criminals, but to erase the next generation of leadership attempting to rebuild Gotham's criminal infrastructure. For Castle, the operation is simple. Remove the men in that room, and the organizations they represent will collapse before they fully reform. The attack begins before Batman can intervene. The first gunshot echoes through the steel skeleton of the warehouse. Then another. Then a sequence of controlled bursts that reveal something unmistakable to anyone familiar with tactical combat. This is not gang violence spiraling out of control. It is a calculated assault executed with military precision. Batman enters the building seconds later, moving through shadows already thick with the smell of gunpowder. Inside he finds the aftermath unfolding. Men who once controlled entire sections of Gotham's criminal economy lie motionless across the concrete floor. The survivors scramble toward exits that no longer exist because Castle has already anticipated their movements. The battlefield has been sealed. Each escape route leads directly into Castle's line of fire. The operation is not chaotic. It is methodical. Every shot serves the same purpose. Elimination. Batman reaches Castle before the final target falls. The confrontation lasts only seconds before words replace violence. Castle does not hesitate when Batman appears. His weapon remains steady. His posture reveals neither surprise nor fear. From his perspective, the arrival of Gotham's protector was inevitable. The only question was whether Batman would arrive early enough to interfere or late enough to witness the results. Batman stops the final shot. not through lethal force, but through interruption. A calculated strike that redirects Castle's aim just enough for the bullet to miss the fleeing criminal by inches. The man escapes through a shattered side door, disappearing into the night with the kind of terrified urgency that only survival can produce. For Batman, the outcome represents success. A life has been spared. The boundary has been preserved. For Castle, the moment represents failure. He studies Batman with the same cold assessment he once used to evaluate hostile combatants. The criminal who escaped will rebuild. The network dismantled tonight will reorganize under new leadership. Months of work undone because Batman insists on preserving a line Castle no longer recognizes as meaningful. The tension between them now stands fully exposed. Their argument is not loud. It does not require raised voices. Batman insists that Gotham cannot survive if execution becomes the standard response to crime. The moment vigilantes begin deciding who deserves to live or die, the city's moral foundation collapses. Castle responds with the quiet certainty of someone who has already reached the end of that moral debate. From his perspective, Gotham's foundation has been collapsing for years. Batman simply refuses to acknowledge it. The conversation reveals something deeper than disagreement. Batman does not deny that many of the men Castle has killed were responsible for horrific crimes. He does not pretend they deserved sympathy or second chances. His objection lies elsewhere. Killing them would mean accepting the role of executioner as a permanent part of his identity. Once that threshold is crossed, there is no mechanism capable of pulling him back. Castle hears that argument differently. To him, Batman sounds like a man protecting himself rather than protecting Gotham. The refusal to kill becomes less a moral principle and more a psychological barrier designed to prevent Bruce Wayne from confronting what his crusade truly requires. Castle believes Batman already understands this. The difference between them is not ignorance but courage. Castle crossed the line. Batman refuses to. The tension between those positions becomes physical. Batman disarms Castle with controlled efficiency, forcing the confrontation into close combat rather than allowing it to escalate into lethal exchange. Their fight is brief but revealing. Castle's movements carry the blunt aggression of a soldier who expects violence to end decisively. Batman's techniques prioritize control, redirection, containment. Even their combat styles reflect their philosophies. One seeks the fastest possible conclusion. The other seeks restraint without surrender. Eventually, Batman incapacitates Castle long enough to secure the scene. Police sirens approach in the distance. The surviving criminals are taken into custody. Bodies are removed. Evidence begins its slow journey through Gotham's legal system. From the perspective of law enforcement, the night represents an unusual success. Several major crime figures have been captured. The rest of the criminal network has been destabilized. Batman leaves the warehouse, knowing the deeper conflict remains unresolved. Castle will not abandon his mission simply because Gotham's protector disapproves. The logic guiding his actions has already survived war, personal loss, and years of confrontation with criminal systems far larger than those operating inside Gotham. One encounter cannot dismantle that conviction. If anything, the confrontation has clarified the nature of the disagreement between them. The city now contains two figures who see the same violence and arrive at opposite conclusions about what must be done. And Gotham is about to discover which interpretation carries the greater weight. The aftermath of their first confrontation does not bring resolution. It brings acceleration. Gotham's criminal ecosystem reacts the way any threatened structure reacts when its internal balance collapses. Power vacuums appear where Frank Castle has eliminated leadership. Rival factions move quickly to occupy those spaces. The city's underworld begins reshaping itself under pressure from two incompatible forces, one that punishes and one that exterminates. In the weeks that follow, Gotham becomes a territory defined by anticipation. Criminal networks adjust their behavior in ways that reveal how deeply the presence of both men has begun to alter the psychological terrain of the city. Operations that once functioned openly now retreat deeper underground. Communication becomes fragmented. Paranoia spreads through criminal hierarchies as leaders realize that survival now depends on avoiding not just Batman's intervention, but Castle's final judgment. Batman studies this shift carefully. His patrols begin uncovering patterns that reveal the unintended consequences of Castle's campaign. Criminal groups that once avoided lethal escalation are now arming themselves more heavily, preparing for confrontations they believe are inevitable. Weapons once reserved for internal disputes begin appearing in street-level conflicts. Informants whisper about entire organizations preparing for war rather than prosecution. The boundary Batman has spent years maintaining is beginning to fracture under pressure. Castle sees the same transformation through a different lens. For him, the reaction of Gotham's underworld proves that his strategy is working. Criminal organizations that once operated with a sense of impunity now behave like hunted animals. They relocate constantly. They abandon infrastructure built over decades because staying in one place invites elimination. Castle interprets this chaos not as collapse but as purification. Criminal empires thrive on stability. Remove that stability, and the system begins consuming itself. The problem lies in what that consumption produces. As Gotham's criminal world destabilizes, new figures rise rapidly through the vacuum left behind. These individuals are younger, less cautious, and far more willing to escalate violence in order to secure territory. The older generation of mob leaders once understood the implicit rules of Gotham's ecosystem. They knew Batman would intervene if their operations crossed certain thresholds. The new generation does not share that restraint. For Batman, the shift represents a dangerous mutation. The criminal networks he once fought were brutal but predictable. They operated within boundaries shaped by decades of conflict with Gotham's institutions and with Batman himself. Castle's intervention has shattered those inherited limits. Now younger leaders seek legitimacy through spectacle and intimidation. Violence becomes louder, more visible, more reckless. Entire neighborhoods begin feeling the consequences. Shootouts erupt in places where criminal organizations once avoided attention. Civilians become collateral damage as gangs attempt to prove dominance in an environment where fear has become the primary currency of survival. Gotham's police struggle to contain the surge in violence because the structure they once relied upon to predict criminal behavior no longer exists. Castle observes the same chaos with cold patience. From his perspective, this phase is inevitable. When a criminal system collapses, it reveals the opportunists who were waiting beneath its surface. These individuals expose themselves quickly because ambition drives them to claim territory before someone else does. Castle understands that this moment of visibility creates opportunity. The new leaders may be reckless, but their recklessness makes them easier to locate and eliminate. Batman understands the trap. If Castle continues executing these emerging figures, the cycle will repeat endlessly. Each elimination creates another vacuum. Each vacuum invites someone more desperate to fill it. Gotham will become an ecosystem permanently defined by escalation, where every criminal knows that survival depends on striking first and striking harder than anyone else. The city will stop functioning as a society struggling with crime and begin resembling a war zone. Their second confrontation emerges from this realization. Batman intercepts Castle during another operation, this time before the first shot is fired. The location is quieter than the warehouse where they first crossed paths. A narrow street in one of Gotham's older industrial districts, where a newly formed criminal group has begun consolidating power after the destruction of its predecessors. Castle has already identified the building where the group's leadership is gathering. Batman steps into his path. The conversation that follows carries none of the restraint that defined their first exchange. Both men now understand the consequences of allowing the other to continue unchecked. Batman argues that Castle's campaign is accelerating the very violence he claims to eliminate. Every execution destabilizes the city further. Criminal organizations are becoming more brutal precisely because they now believe survival depends on it. Castle responds with equal certainty. In his view, the violence rising across Gotham is not the result of his actions, but the exposure of what was already there. The criminals now fighting openly in the streets were always capable of that brutality. Batman's system merely concealed it beneath layers of controlled conflict. Castle believes the city is witnessing the true nature of its underworld for the first time. Their disagreement reaches its core. Batman insists that justice must preserve the possibility of redemption and the authority of institutions. Even criminals must be subject to laws rather than personal judgment. If individuals like Castle begin deciding who deserves to live or die, then society loses the distinction that separates justice from revenge. Castle rejects the premise entirely. The criminals he hunts have already chosen their path. They have killed, trafficked, and destroyed lives without hesitation. To preserve their existence in the name of legal principle feels, to Castle, like protecting predators while civilians remain vulnerable. He believes Batman's moral line serves the comfort of society more than the safety of its victims. Neither man convinces the other. The argument collapses back into action when the criminal group inside the building becomes aware of their presence. Gunfire erupts from the upper floors as the gang attempts to eliminate both vigilantes before they can intervene. For a brief moment, Batman and Castle move through the same battlefield with identical purpose, dismantling the attackers who attempt to escape into the surrounding streets. Yet even in cooperation, their methods reveal the same irreconcilable divide. Batman incapacitates opponents with precise strikes that leave them alive, but unable to continue fighting. Castle neutralizes threats permanently whenever the opportunity presents itself. Each moment of combat becomes a silent argument about what justice requires when confronted with violence that refuses restraint. By the time the police arrive, the scene resembles every other battlefield Gotham has begun producing. Arrested criminals lie beside the bodies of those who will never stand trial. Evidence scatters across the pavement as officers attempt to reconstruct what happened. Batman disappears into the city's skyline as he always does, leaving behind the fragile possibility that the legal system can still process the chaos unfolding beneath it. Castle remains long enough to observe the outcome. From his perspective, the night demonstrates exactly why his mission must continue. The criminals Batman spared will eventually return to the same streets, guided by the same impulses that led them there in the first place. The bodies left behind will never harm anyone again. The difference between those two outcomes feels obvious to him. The city now stands between these two interpretations of justice, and the longer Gotham remains their shared battlefield, the more difficult it becomes to pretend the line between them can survive unchanged. The conflict between Batman and the Punisher extends far beyond the fictional streets where their actions unfold. Their opposition reveals a deeper tension embedded within modern cultural imagination, one that emerges whenever societies confront the uncomfortable distance between justice as an ideal and justice as an act. These two figures do not simply represent different methods of fighting crime. They embody competing visions of what moral authority looks like once institutions begin to fail. Batman emerges from a cultural environment deeply invested in the preservation of systems. His mythology belongs to a world that still believes order can be restored through discipline, intelligence, and restraint. The figure standing on Gotham's rooftops becomes a symbolic guardian of boundaries. He acknowledges that violence exists and sometimes must be confronted directly, Yet he refuses to allow that confrontation to dissolve the moral architecture that defines civilization itself. This restraint transforms Batman into something more than a vigilante. He becomes a stabilizing myth. His refusal to kill functions as a kind of invisible constitution governing the territory he inhabits. Even those who fear him understand that his power operates within limits. Those limits preserve the psychological distinction between the hero who enforces justice and the criminal who abandons it. Gotham may remain dark and unstable, but the presence of that boundary prevents the city from collapsing completely into chaos. The Punisher disrupts that symbolic structure entirely. Frank Castle represents the moment when faith in institutional justice erodes beyond repair. His story emerges from cultural environments increasingly skeptical of systems that promise protection, yet repeatedly fail to deliver it. In that context, the Punisher becomes a figure of ruthless clarity. He eliminates the procedural hesitation that defines legal justice and replaces it with decisive action. The criminals he targets disappear permanently. The system does not have to catch up because the conflict ends immediately. This difference reshapes how audiences interpret both figures. Batman asks the audience to believe that restraint remains meaningful even in a world saturated with violence. His presence suggests that moral lines must survive precisely when circumstances make them difficult to maintain. Without those lines, the distinction between hero and criminal becomes impossible to sustain. Batman therefore protects not only Gotham's citizens, but also the fragile idea that justice requires limits. The Punisher asks a different question. What happens when those limits become the reason criminals survive? What happens when legal procedures protect the rights of predators while victims remain permanently erased? Castle's existence forces audiences to confront a darker possibility. Perhaps justice, without finality, becomes indistinguishable from weakness. Perhaps certain forms of violence require responses that legal institutions are structurally incapable of delivering. This tension reveals something profound about how societies imagine power. Batman represents controlled power. His discipline suggests that strength must always answer to something greater than individual will. Even when he operates outside the law, he behaves as if the law's moral authority still exists somewhere above him. His restraint protects the symbolic legitimacy of justice itself. The audience may admire his efficiency, but it is his refusal to become an executioner that ultimately preserves his role as a hero. Frank Castle represents liberated power. Once the boundary separating justice from revenge dissolves, power no longer requires institutional permission. Castle's authority emerges from the certainty of his conviction, rather than from any external system. He does not seek validation from courts, governments, or public opinion. His mission becomes self-contained. Criminals deserve elimination because their actions have already placed them outside the moral territory where mercy might exist. Culturally, this distinction produces intense reactions. Some audiences view the Punisher as the logical conclusion of the frustrations many people feel toward criminal justice systems that appear slow, compromised, or ineffective. In this interpretation, Castle becomes a symbol of decisive clarity in a world dominated by hesitation. He eliminates threats permanently and refuses to indulge the procedural delays that often allow violent individuals to continue harming others. Other audiences see something far more unsettling in that logic. The moment individuals assume the authority to decide who deserves to live or die, society begins drifting toward a territory where justice becomes indistinguishable from personal judgment. The Punisher may target criminals, but the structure he represents could easily expand beyond that category once the principle itself becomes acceptable. In that sense, Castle represents the seductive danger of unrestrained justice rather than its triumph. Batman therefore functions as a counterweight to that seduction. His refusal to cross the line forces the audience to confront the discomfort of restraint. He allows criminals to survive encounters that might otherwise end their lives. Some return to cause further harm. Some exploit the legal protections that guarantee their survival. Yet Batman insists that the preservation of moral boundaries matters more than the efficiency of eliminating threats. This position places him in a paradoxical role. He becomes the protector not only of innocent citizens, but also of the principle that justice must remain separate from revenge. That separation protects society from the temptation to resolve violence through permanent eradication. Batman stands as a reminder that once killing becomes acceptable as a form of justice, it becomes increasingly difficult to limit who may wield that authority. The Punisher represents the opposite trajectory. Castle emerges whenever societies begin losing faith that restraint serves any meaningful purpose. His presence reflects the growing belief that certain individuals or systems exploit moral boundaries rather than respecting them. Criminal empires flourish within legal loopholes. Corrupt institutions shield powerful offenders from consequences. In such environments, the figure who eliminates hesitation begins to appear not monstrous but necessary. The cultural fascination with both figures reveals the psychological tension modern societies carry toward violence. People want protection from those who exploit weakness. They want predators removed from the social landscape with certainty and permanence. At the same time, they fear the consequences of granting individuals the authority to decide who deserves that fate. Batman and the Punisher stand on opposite sides of that dilemma, each offering a solution that exposes the dangers embedded within the other. Their conflict therefore functions as a symbolic arena where society rehearses its deepest anxieties about justice. Batman defends the fragile architecture of restraint even when that restraint appears frustrating or ineffective. The Punisher exposes the rage that emerges when people believe that architecture no longer protects them. One preserves the system, the other abandons it entirely. Both positions resonate because both contain truths about how violence operates within human communities. This is why their opposition refuses to fade from cultural memory. Batman reassures audiences that moral boundaries can survive even under extreme pressure. The Punisher reminds them that those boundaries sometimes feel painfully inadequate. Between these two figures lies the unresolved question haunting every society that struggles with crime and punishment. How much restraint can justice afford before it begins to fail? And how much violence can justice absorb before it becomes something else entirely? The conflict between Batman and Frank Castle does not conclude with victory, defeat, or reconciliation. It settles into the symbolic structure of modern myth, where opposing figures continue to exist as unresolved answers to the same fundamental question. Their opposition becomes less about individual encounters and more about the enduring tension they represent inside the cultural imagination. Batman remains anchored to Gotham's skyline, a figure defined as much by what he refuses to do as by what he accomplishes. His restraint becomes the invisible foundation of his legend. Criminals fear him because of his skill, his intelligence, and the relentless pressure he applies to their operations. Yet the deeper meaning of his presence lies in the boundary he preserves. The moment he refuses to kill becomes the moment Gotham retains its claim to civilization, rather than surrendering entirely to the logic of war. That refusal carries weight precisely because it is difficult. Batman does not deny the reality that some criminals deserve death. He confronts monsters who have destroyed lives with cruelty that defies ordinary moral language. The temptation to end their existence permanently exists in every confrontation. His strength lies not in denying that temptation, but in refusing to let it reshape the structure of his mission. The line between justice and vengeance remains intact because he holds it in place with constant discipline. Frank Castle arrives at a different kind of permanence. The Punisher exists as a figure who has already crossed the threshold Batman refuses to approach. His mission no longer concerns itself with preserving systems or maintaining moral distinctions that institutions claim to uphold. Castle moves through the criminal world with the clarity of someone who has accepted a brutal premise. Certain forms of violence cannot be negotiated with. They must be removed entirely from the landscape in order to protect those who cannot defend themselves. This difference creates a permanent symbolic polarity. Batman represents the idea that justice must remain constrained by principles larger than individual anger. His war against crime exists within a structure that preserves the possibility of redemption, law, and social order. Even when Gotham appears hopelessly corrupt, Batman behaves as if the city still deserves the moral architecture that defines civilization. The Punisher represents the moment when belief in that architecture collapses. Castle's war emerges from the conviction that institutions have already failed beyond repair. The criminals he hunts exploit the legal protections that once separated justice from revenge. They rebuild their operations after every arrest. They manipulate systems designed to guarantee fairness. Castle responds by removing those systems from the equation entirely. His justice does not pause for trials, appeals, or rehabilitation. It ends the threat immediately. Neither figure eliminates the other, because their conflict does not operate on the level of victory. Batman cannot destroy the Punisher's philosophy because the world that produces Frank Castle continues to exist. Every time the legal system fails to protect innocent lives, every time criminals escape consequences through corruption or procedural weakness, the logic behind Castle's mission regains strength. The anger he embodies remains available to anyone who begins to believe that restraint has become indistinguishable from impotence. At the same time, the Punisher cannot replace Batman as the dominant symbol of justice. The moment execution becomes the primary response to crime, societies begin confronting the terrifying implications of that decision. Who decides who deserves death? What happens when that authority spreads beyond individuals like Castle? How quickly does the distinction between criminal elimination and political violence begin to dissolve? Batman's refusal to kill remains necessary because it protects society from the seductive simplicity of lethal certainty. This tension ensures that both figures endure. Batman continues standing at the center of Gotham's moral gravity, absorbing the pressure created by a city that constantly tests the limits of restraint. His mission remains unfinished because the problems he fights can never be resolved permanently. Crime returns. Corruption resurfaces. Violence evolves. Yet his presence preserves the idea that justice must always remain accountable to principles greater than the individuals who enforce it. Frank Castle continues moving through the shadows beyond those principles. He exists wherever the belief in institutional justice begins to fracture. His mission thrives in environments where fear and anger overshadow patience. Castle does not wait for society to solve the problems that produced him. He acts immediately, decisively, and without hesitation. The criminals he encounters rarely survive long enough to rebuild their empires. Together, these two figures form a symbolic frontier. Batman stands on one side of that boundary, defending the fragile line that separates justice from revenge. Castle stands on the other side, demonstrating what happens when that line is erased in the pursuit of permanent security. Their existence ensures that the question dividing them never disappears. Is justice defined by the restraint it preserves, or by the threats it eliminates? Gotham never resolves that question completely. The city continues living beneath the shadow of both answers. On its rooftops stands a figure who believes the line must never be crossed. Somewhere in its darker corners moves another who believes that line should have disappeared long ago. Between them lies the unresolved space where modern society continues to wrestle with its deepest fear. That justice, when pushed far enough, may begin to resemble the violence it was meant to stop.